So just to kind of introduce our final keynote and our last kind of presentation for you guys today, then we've got, very lucky here to have Dr. Josephine Perry. I've known Josie for a number of years now. We first met at Hampton University a few years ago. So on a personal note, it's great to see Josie's progression to becoming a very prominent sport and exercise psychologist. So I've always personally found Josie's questions to be very insightful and challenging, and once or twice I could actually answer some of those questions, and her talks to be very engaging and full of practical tips. So Josie's a HCPC registered sport and exercise psychologist, is the founder of Performance in Mind, working with sport, business and the stage to help individuals overcome barriers to success and to try and help them achieve their goals. So Josie's worked with a range of different athletes and individuals, from elite, developmental and amateur athletes, to try and work and provide psychological solutions, as well as finding time to write a number of books, including the 10 Pillars of Success. So this leads nicely on to Josie's talk today, which is going to provide 10 sports psych tools to help us become more successful coaches. So I'll hand you over to Josie now, and we'll have time for questions after that.
Thanks, Adam. I'm going to share my... Does that work?
Yeah, that looks great.
Hurrah. Brilliant, except I'm right at the end. That was badly planned. Now you get a backwards view. Cool. So thanks for having me, everyone. This is a brilliant opportunity to reflect on the things that we're doing in sports psychology every day. Actually, how do you replicate them to help coaches? What I love most about sports psychology is that the techniques and the tips and the approaches that we use work across so many different areas of life. So all I've done for the last 2 weeks, it feels like, is work with my junior athletes to help them calm down before their A-levels or their GCSE exams. And it was really great to see that the techniques we use work in that environment just as they work in our sports environment or on the stage. So I wanted to share 10 of those tips or those techniques with you guys today. A bit about me. I got into sports psychology because I used to do lots of this stuff, lots of triathlon. And in 2013, I went over to Melbourne to do the Melbourne Ironman. And I was standing on the beach in Frankston, and all my training had been done in 20-metre pools in London that were nicely chlorinated and very flat and calm. And I'm standing on the beach in Frankston, and having already been scared by everyone talking about sharks, I was now utterly terrified because there were the most enormous waves I have ever seen. Even the Aussies were looking a little bit scared at this point. And the guy in the tannoy said, "You can't change those waves. All you can change is how you feel about them." And it was genuinely the first time in all my life of doing sports and dance as a kid that I'd ever really thought about using my brain to help with the sports that I was doing. I'm a very, very average amateur athlete, but it suddenly clicked that if I use my brain to think a bit differently, I could be a bit better. And it spiraled me into, as Adam said, going to Roehampton to really understand and learn psychology better, and ended up down the route of completely changing my career into this area. So I'm only an amateur athlete. I've never competed at an elite level, but I am very privileged that I get to work with elites and athletes of every level every day to help them perform at their best. I often say I'm probably not as good with the elite athletes, because what really matters to me is having happy athletes, because I believe if you've got a happy athlete, they perform better. And so much of my work is about how do we really help their well-being so they can perform at their best, rather than it feeling like it's about chasing medals all of the time. So today I'm going to talk through 10 techniques. They're ones that I use all of the time with athletes, with actors. I work a lot with people in medicine, education, business, lots of entrepreneurs, lots of people in the finance world who have to make decisions, big decisions about lots and lots of money very, very quickly. And they find these techniques really helpful. And I've themed them under 5 areas. And there are 5 factors I think really help us flourish in sport, either as an athlete or as a coach. So I would say 80% of my work is helping people manage their anxiety. It's the biggest reason that people come to see me. And I don't know if that's because I've become known for helping that. And most referrals come from athletes or parents talking to each other and sharing kind of go and see this person for that help. Or whether it's grown, particularly since COVID and people having lots of ambiguity and a lack of control over the last 2 years. But anxiety seems to be a really, really big issue, that performance anxiety before we go out to do our sport. The second area is minimizing perfectionism. And I find this an absolutely fascinating area because sometimes we need it to do well, but then it holds us back. And when parents particularly used to phone me to work with their children who had performance anxiety, I used to ask, does your child have elements of perfectionism? And I don't anymore because no one has ever said no. So they tend to go hand in hand, that if you've seen someone who's got very high levels of performance anxiety, they're often quite perfectionistic as well. The third factor I think is really important is about really focusing on a mastery mindset, moving away from that idea that we must win, and instead looking at how can we be brilliant? How can we focus on mastering our sport and getting enjoyment that way? Fourth is about controlling the controllables, which is such a cheesy quote, but it's so helpful for making us focus on the things that matter and stop us wasting all that energy, mental energy, on things we just cannot do anything about. And then finally, I'd never really thought about self-awareness when I was doing my training as a sports psychologist. But when I wrote my first book, I had a whole bunch of techniques that kind of felt like they didn't have a home, but they also felt really, really important. And when I investigated them, it was that element of self-awareness that is so important. And it's actually probably at the core of everything I do now, that when you understand yourself better as an athlete or as a coach, you can create the environment you need to be able to perform and thrive really, really well. We can only do that if we've got those underpinnings of self-awareness. So they're the 5 factors we're going to talk through, and we'll have 2 techniques for each factor. The trickiest one, but the one I think if you can get on top of this, other things feel so much easier, and that's anxiety, particularly performance anxiety. So we're not talking about clinical anxiety here, but it's that I've got a big speech to give, I've got a really scary tutorial to teach, I've got selection day for everybody coming to be coached, I've got a really big competition. That level of anxiety, and usually about a week ahead of that, how people are feeling. So I think it's really important that we can kind of get on top of this one. And one of the ways I really like to do it is by giving athletes, coaches, any clients, almost the idea that they've got a helicopter above their head and they can look down on themselves to see what's going on, see if they can look inside their head and figure out which bit of their brain is making decisions at that moment. Because when they're much more on top of that, they can take a step back, they can distance themselves, and they're able to be much more rational with what's going on. It takes a lot of the emotion out of things. So we start with looking at our brain under pressure. And we break it down into 3 zones that we can talk to athletes or ourselves about. And we start with the habit zone. And I love this bit because this matches what you guys as coaches are doing so much. It's about practice and repetition and getting on top of things and having movements come automatically because you've practiced them so much. So I don't know which scientist figured this out, but somebody counted that we have to make about 35,000 decisions every day. Most of those decisions we would never have time to actually purposely, proactively make in our brain. Our brain needs to do most of this for us. And so those are the decisions that come from the habit zone. So when you're running, you don't think, unless you're doing a drill session, where do my knees need to be? If you're shooting, you're not actively focused on what I might need to do, You do it because you've done it thousands of times before. And so we say to clients, we probably want about 90% of what you do in your sporting environment to sit within that habit zone. And that can get most of what you need done. You don't have to stress or panic or worry about it. It just happens. Then we move over to our logic zone. We would love the other 10% of what we do to sit in that logic zone. So that's your prefrontal cortex, right at the front of your brain, and it's attached to your hippocampus. And in your hippocampus is where your knowledge and your learning and your experience and all your evidence is captured. So if you've got a decision to make, and it's a much bigger decision, I know there's a goal to be shot at. Should I try to shoot it for myself, or should I wait for somebody who's closer and I'll send it to them? How am I making that decision? Goes back into the hippocampus. What happened last time I had this decision? I sent it to Fred. Fred's an awesome shot and it worked. I'm going to do that again. And you make a great decision. So we love that part. We want the other 10% to sit there. It's rational, it's sensible, it's based on evidence and experience. And if we just had those two parts of our head, our brain, life would be so lovely. And we'd have no anxiety and it would be awesome. But our brains aren't designed to make us fantastic coaches or athletes or sports psychs. Our brains are designed for survival. And so we have a very significant part of our brain near the bottom, that threat zone, officially called the amygdala. And its job is to look out for all the types of threats that could harm you. And with physical threats, that's very easy for us to see. So as you saw, I'm a triathlete. I often have to cycle down great big mountains in races where there's no barriers on the side, and I am a total scaredy cat. My amygdala, as I am going down that mountain, is screaming at me, press the brakes, you're going to die. We'll do whatever it takes to stop me putting myself in that threat. And that's very clear for me to see. What we don't see so much is the fact that the amygdala is also trying to protect us from psychological threats. And often those psychological threats are based around who we believe we are as a person. And so if someone has a very, very strong sporting identity or coaching identity, anytime there is a risk to that coaching or sporting identity, our threat zone is triggered. And that could be anytime you have to stand up and talk about yourself as a coach, or your team or your athletes are competing in really big competitions where you really know how much it means to them and how much you've invested in their development. And so when that threat zone is triggered, whether it's something physical or something psychological, it alerts our brain and it sends around two chemicals around our body, adrenaline and cortisol, because it's trying to help you escape from that threat. And with that, we tend to have 4 responses. Everyone will know the first 2. There's fight, that kind of, I'm getting ready to go and attack this thing that's scaring me. And there's flight, I'm running away from it. And those are the people I don't even get to see as a sports psych, because they don't show up to races and they've quit racing or training or events a long time ago. But we also have freeze. And that's the group I tend to see a lot of, the people that will turn up, but they've almost shut down inside. They've gone very, very quiet. They don't want to be there and they really don't want to chat to people beforehand. And we see one other group, less so in sports, but occasionally, and that's fawn. And that's if they've previously had a coach who's very, very bullying, or they're in a relationship where there may be some violence or level of intimidation, and they're almost treading on eggshells around people because they never want to upset anybody. So those are the 4 responses we have. And that's why we're having this cortisol, adrenaline sent around our body. And it tends to have 5 main responses physically in our body. And for any of the coaches on here that compete as well, or play, you may well recognize quite a few of these. The one almost everybody gets is that nauseous tummy. So I've had a number of athletes that will be throwing up before any event. I always love at the start of London Marathon, and they have the helicopters above Blackheath, and they look down, there's just row upon row of of porta toilets, and queues are enormous because before any big race like that, your body wants to be as light as possible to escape this scary thing you're about to do. So we get those butterflies in our tummy, but sometimes they get a bit too vigorous. We get increased heart rate. We get increased respiratory rate, and that's an important one we'll come back to. We get really tight shoulders and back muscles. Often you'll see people before matches clicking their head side to side, rolling their shoulders to try and release some of that. And we also lose some of our peripheral vision and our hearing. And each of these elements will be individual of you, but also important on the sport that you do. So we see the tight muscles for your shoulders and back is really devastating if you're playing tennis or you're trying to row. Whereas if you're a runner, it's not such a big a deal. If you've lost some peripheral vision and hearing, again, not great, not so much an issue if you're a runner, but really bad if you're a rugby player and you're going to miss somebody coming in from the side, or in football and you miss important cues. So really important to figure out, what does my body do? More of that self-awareness. How do I notice what happens when I'm feeling anxious? And the main triggers we tend to see for our threat zone being triggered from the psychological perspective, it's value violation. Things that really matter to you, somebody has violated in some way. We'll come back to that one at the end because it's really key. Fear of failure is a huge one. Absolute, I want to do this, but I'm utterly terrified I won't do well enough. And if I don't do well enough, am I really the athlete or the coach that I feel I should be? Fear of judgment, a huge amount of that, particularly with the more that social media is used in sport. I've had athletes in the past who are like, I don't mind if I win or lose, but I mind that the WhatsApp group's going to be chatting about me afterwards. And those things can really trigger some of our, especially younger athletes. Perfectionism, if you've set yourself an impossible goal to reach, it's going to be a real threat trigger because you can never reach it, it doesn't exist, but you're going to feel awful the whole time because you're trying so hard and you really want to be that perfect athlete. Expectations are a big one. And that's particularly for our junior athletes. However good mum and dad are at not putting any expectation or pressure on them, those athletes know what their parents have invested and their coaches have invested, and they know how much time they've spent taking them to places and events, and that really lays quite heavy on them. And then poor communication is a really fascinating one. A really lovely example where an athlete had done an erg test. They were a rower, and their erg test suggested they should be in the top boat that Saturday, and everything was done on the Wednesday. Erg test decided which boat you raced in at the weekend, and they hadn't been put in the top boat. They'd been put in a second boat, and to them that meant they were utter failure. All of their threat zone was triggered. They felt dreadful about it because they'd done everything they could and they hadn't got the outcome that they deserved. And they were in an absolute state, wanting to drop out of the sport. And the coach was like, I have no idea why somebody is behaving in this way, what's going on. If the coach had communicated, the water we are racing in at the weekend is really rough. We need some seriously strong rowers in the second team to keep the boat safe, to keep everybody rowing well, and it will be a really good leadership opportunity for that athlete. It was actually a compliment. But because there was no communication there, it had been seen from two very different ways, to the point where one athlete wanted to quit. So poor communication can really, really bring up our threat zone to trigger and that anxiety. And one I imagine particularly if you've got junior athletes as coaches, or you've got athletes with ADHD, unfairness is one of the most common values that tends to get violated. And it can have really, really strong trigger responses. So that's one to look out for when you're coaching of athletes who are feeling life is unfair. So the first technique we use, I'm going to do this. I would love for you guys to join in with me, or I'll feel really silly with my eyes closed on my own. We do this one called colourful breathing. And we do it because when your amygdala gets triggered, and your breathing rate goes up, It tends to go from about 12, 13 breaths that you're probably breathing right now, up to around 20 or 22. So it's a significant jump. And as that breathing rate goes up, it's one of the things that tells your brain something is wrong. And your brain's being told something is wrong, which means it sends around adrenaline and cortisol to try and get away from the scary thing that it's being attacked by. And you just end up in this horrible cycle of anxiety. So this is a lovely technique to calm things down, to almost have a circuit breaker for your body feeding into your brain. And it's also a lovely one if you struggle to sleep at night. I use it all the time with my daughter, who's only 5, but she picks up on the colourful breathing and we can do it together really nicely. So if you're up for doing it with me, we close our eyes. And I'd like you to breathe in blue air through your nose for 4, 3, 2, 1. And red air out of your mouth for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Blue air in through your nose for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Red air out through your mouth for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And open your eyes. And if you do that 5 times, it takes about a minute, but it massively cuts your breathing rate, calms everything down very, very quickly. So if you as coaches have got athletes that are really struggling with their anxiety, it's a really, really nice technique to be able to sit down with them just for a minute, but it helps bring them back to calmness. And you can do that if they're anxious before, or if they start to lose their temper in the middle of things. I see it a lot in footballers and a lot in tennis. When something goes wrong or somebody cheats, it's usually the issue. They get very, very anxious. Breathing rate gets really high. Colourful breathing is a really lovely way to calm it down, bring it back. And the other way I tend to work on this one is to get to know our amygdalas. So at the moment, it just feels like a really annoying part of your brain. It's kind of like a parent that wraps their child in cotton wool because it wants you to stay safe and survive beyond all else. But in doing that, it wants you never to leave your comfort zone. And if you're to be a brilliant coach, you're going to constantly need to leave your comfort zone. You're going to constantly need to stretch yourself. And our amygdalas hate us doing that. So often what we try and do in our head quite naturally is to shout it down. But that doesn't really help. It just causes like an argument in our own head. So what we really try to do with clients is to get to know it, to befriend it, to soothe it and calm it. And the first way we do that is by naming it. So all of my clients know what their amygdala is called. I've had the most brilliant names ever. Many of you are probably too young, but one that's really common is Stripe, because there's a movie called The Gremlins that was probably in the 80s or 90s, and they were really cute little animals. And when they got wet, they used to go utterly crazy, cause complete chaos. And one of these gremlins was called Stripe. And so lots of my adult athletes can imagine their amygdalas like calm, 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 causing utter chaos once it's been triggered. But you can call it anything. Mine's called Joe, because that was my nickname at school that I hate. And so it's part of me, but it's a really annoying part of me that doesn't help me thrive and doesn't help me be brilliant at what I do. So once you've got your name, and it's a great one to help your athletes with to name them, is to imagine what kind of character it is, because we don't want to be seeing it in our head, because in our head it's a fact. The thoughts and the information it gives us feel factual and true. And yet most of the things our amygdala say to us isn't true. It's not fact, it's just a thought. And it's much easier to see it as a thought if it's slightly separate, if it's a character. So you see here, mine's a meerkat, because I can imagine my meerkat popping its head out of the sand and looking around for threats. And it might see something it could fight and it would dive out. It might freeze if it's something really scary, or it might run away and hide. But you'll be amazed how quickly you can think of your own kind of character or your athletes. Everybody I've worked with has been able to come up with something very quickly because it's what they imagine, this annoying voices in their head that's trying to stop them doing these things that they really, really want to do, that sometimes they're scared of. When you get to then befriend your amygdala, it's got a name, it's got a character. It's much easier to distance those thoughts from the reality of what's going on. And we work with athletes so we can find a way of, for me, thanks, Joe, I hear you. I know you're scared right now. It's quite a scary situation, but you really wanted to get faster on the bike. So you need to push yourself. So keep focusing, keep pushing, just push, push, push. And instead of it feeling like a great big fight in my head, it's actually getting to soothe it, to calm it, but still reminding myself why it's important that I'm taking this on. So those are the two things we tend to do for that anxiety. The next area is perfectionism. And I think this one is fascinating. I won't go into the academic side of this. There's a huge amount around perfectionism in academia, which is brilliant to work with. But on a really base level, when you're working with yourself or with athletes who've got some elements of perfectionism, it's very helpful for them, first of all, just to realize that it's there. Because often with perfectionism, you don't want to admit you've got perfectionism, not because it's a bad thing, but because you don't believe you're perfect enough and that you don't deserve to have that perfectionism. So what we really try and notice and talk about with them is that it's a double-edged sword. That perfectionism you've got has meant you have set a really, really high bar for your performance, and you will work incredibly hard to achieve the goals that you have set for yourself. And you will get very close, but you will never get there because perfect doesn't exist. And even when you get close with that trait, all you will do is raise the bar. And so there'll always be a gap between where you feel you should be, and should is the word to listen out for with your athletes, and where you actually are. And that gap is where we notice a huge amount of kind of poor well-being. It stops you celebrating successes. It makes you feel like a failure. It means you never feel like you've achieved what you've really set out to do. And you'll often have those constant comparisons with other people. And sport's the worst world for comparisons, because that's what we do all day, every day. And then when our athletes or ourselves get off and we've got some time free, we'll end up on social media and we get to notice how brilliant everybody else is, because we're watching their very best life, living our very realistic one that at that point might not seem brilliant. So you will do well as a perfectionist, but at the time you won't notice it. And we find that can cause people some real psychological harm when they can't appreciate how well they've done. So one of the first tasks I set somebody who's got perfectionism is the yes/no game. And the reason we do this is to try and increase flexibility. We want people to train their brain to know you don't have to be perfect and you will still survive. And so we ask them for a week to either do something they never normally do, or to do something, or not to do something that they always do. So that could be, if your go-to thing is you get up in the morning and you shake out your duvet and you make it look beautiful, can you not do that for a week? If you always clean your teeth before breakfast, could you do it after breakfast instead? If you always have a coffee first thing, could you have a tea instead? So anything in your life that is part of your routine that feels very rigid, can you change it? And you know someone's a perfectionist because when you ask them to do this, they just look at you in utter horror. So it's a really interesting thing, but it starts to train your brain, into realizing that things don't have to always be done in exactly the same way. And the other one I've just started to incorporate much more is the ta-da list. So, and it always has to be had in the jazz hands. All of us are probably guilty of having a to-do list somewhere. Pieces of paper around your laptop right now, on your phone, on your computer. We feel like we've always got more and more to do. And even more so if you're a perfectionist, of like, these are all the things I'm going to have to do before I've achieved this amazing goal up here. And it means we forget to celebrate the cool stuff we've done along the way. So one of my pieces of advice to all my athletes I work with is to keep a training diary. And it'll have the core things you'd expect in a training diary, like what efforts did I do today? What physio might I have done? What was my peak flow if they're asthmatic? But we also have two things that they have to put at the end of each day. One is something they're grateful for, because I'm a really big believer in celebrating gratitude. And the other one is something ta-da, something they're proud that they achieved that day. Because at the end of the year, they haven't just got how many miles they've run or how many training sessions they've gone to, but they've got 365 things they've achieved that they're proud of themselves. And that is a really nice way to help them celebrate the small successes. Then we move on to mastery. So we know that confidence is a huge differentiator between those who do well in sport and those who don't, and in life. But confidence comes from the two most robust sources of confidence tend to be really, really good preparation and having achieved things before. And we can kind of really focus those with athletes as building mastery. And this is really helpful because it takes us away from this whole focus on I must win. And winning just makes everything very binary, very black and white. And in some sports, in football, you might win 50% of the time. In my sport of triathlon, I don't think I've ever won a triathlon. In fact, I know I haven't. I'm never going to. That's okay. I love doing it for the sake of getting better. And if we want people to be in sport for life, we need to really help them focus on that mastery bit. And it was really brought home to me when I interviewed Dame Sarah Story for a book I was writing. And she said she doesn't always enjoy winning. And I was like, yeah, you can say that. You have won everything in the world hundreds of times. She's amazing. You can say that. And she's like, yeah, but when I win, I can't get better because I haven't got somebody to learn from. I can't see how I could do things differently or better. And so actually what I really want to do is focus on mastery. And she's forever being asked, when's she going to retire? I think she's 42. She's got 2 kids. She's achieved more than anybody else in the world of Paralympics. She's like, when I stop getting better. But it's all about mastery. And I think the more we can help focus our athletes and ourselves on mastery and being brilliant at what we do and honing those skills, rather than focusing on wins and losses, ironically, we win more because we've taken that pressure off ourselves, but we get much better. And so the techniques I use for this, I actually put on one postcard, and I send out packs of these postcards to all my athletes that I work with. So on one side of the postcard, it's helping us develop a mastery mindset before any challenges we do. So we look at the event, we pick our goal. The rule with the goal is it cannot be to win. You can have any other goal you want, but we try and get it something that's controllable. Then we have coach on a shoulder. And this is a bit where you guys can be really helpful at feeding in to your athletes. And they all know very quickly. It's the idea that if your coach, you guys, were in Alice in Wonderland and you drank that tiny little vial of liquid that Alice gets that says, drink me, and it shrinks you down to a teeny tiny size. So when your athlete's competing, you're on their shoulder, shouting into their ear. What's the one thing you're most likely to shout about their technique or their form? So for me, when I'm running, I know my coach would yell, head up, stick my head up, shoulders go back, chest comes forward, legs rise, cannot help but run faster. And athletes are usually very astute on what you guys know they should be doing, but sometimes they might need a little bit of help. But similarly for you as coaches, before you go into a difficult environment, thinking about, well, if you had a mentor, what would they be saying to you about how you coach, what you want to be remembering? And that's a short sentence that goes in there. Then we focus on 3 of their strengths. And be like, what strengths are you taking into this competitive environment? What's going to help you do really, really well? 3 sessions they've done in the build-up. And that's the reason why it's very helpful to have a training diary, because they can look back through their diary and they can pull out, oh, that session we did last Tuesday of sprint repetitions, I nailed all of them. That goes in there. Similarly for you as a coach, what sessions have I done where I walked away from that going, yeah, I nailed it? Your motivational mantra. This is really tricky with junior athletes because not so much has happened in their lives to date to really know why they're doing their sport. It's much easier if you're working with adults. And similarly for you as coaches, why am I doing this? What matters to me? What's going to push me round? And then a really good question to ask them and you, I perform at my best when? Because that highlights the environment when you do well. I know as a triathlete, I perform at my best when I've got great support. All my best races are when my husband and my daughter are there, because that helps me feel good. Many of my athletes, it's like they'll say, when I feel calm, when I don't feel nervous beforehand. It's like, great, how can we create that environment for you? So we do this beforehand. Afterwards, there's literally the other side of the postcard. We look at what was our goal? Did we achieve it? What was our moment of pride? Get them thinking about the good stuff. What were they proud of in that day? And then what went well? What didn't go well? And the rule is they have to have an equal number of both. So they can't focus on either it was brilliant or it was awful and dramatic. We've got to have some balance there. What will they continue doing? What will they do differently? And then really important, at least one action that you're going to take back into training over that week. And this means any event that we do, any competitive event or any training session can never fail. We can have a disastrous event. We could come last, we could drop out, but we could still learn something from it. And so it was still worth our time in going. And that's what we really want to reiterate, that this is all a long process. This is a journey for our athletes and for ourselves, and we're continually moving forward. It stops us feeling like, why did I bother doing that? I got nothing from it. It was embarrassing. All those thoughts that our amygdala feeds to us. So those we really use, and I will use them every single event with an athlete, whether it's cycling across America that I've got somebody doing at the moment, or whether it's a one-off really, really hard training session that they've been dreading. And here's the cheesy line. That how do we help people control the controllables? And how do we help ourselves do it? So the first one I always do is called a control map. And this is really eye-opening to people. So I'll literally get them with a sheet of paper, 3 columns, and we start with the no control. What in this competition that's coming up can you not control? And they'll end up with a huge list of things. And when you look through the list of things, they're usually the things they worry about the most. I can't control my opponents. I can't control the weather. I can't control whether I win or lose. I can't control the umpire. I can't control what the supporters cheer or shout. And then they suddenly realize all those things they've been worrying about, nothing they can do about them. And it's just wasted energy. Sometimes there's things in influence, might be about what time you get there, behaviours of others, your own supporters and what they might shout. And then we look at that control level. What can I control? Once they've done their list of that, so they might be able to control their kit. They can usually control what they eat or drink before or during. They can control their attitude towards all the things they can't control. There's not that much of them. Then they know they can focus all of their efforts on that. And they're usually much more task driven. So they get really focused on tasks and they stop focusing on the outcome, which is something they can't control. And that can be a really nice way of getting people thinking about the right things before an event. And same for yourselves as coaches. How do I control the bits I can control and accept and let go of the stuff that I can't? And then this is a really lovely one, and I would advise us all to do this, particularly if we're having a bit of a tough time with our coaching, are really helping ourselves understand what we are good at and where our strengths come. And it's really helpful because we have so many biases in our brain. We have a negative bias. Again, I don't know the source for this, but apparently the negative in our brain is about 5 times stronger than the positive. And it makes perfect sense. Brain is there for survival. We need to remember the negatives much more so we don't do things that would harm us again. But it also means we tend to forget the things we're good at because we're so focused on what we're not. So there are 6 areas we tackle here when we're going through our strengths, and we try and find 2 things for each area. So 2 things around your knowledge. What around your knowledge do you feel like is a strength? 2 areas around the strategies that we tend to use. 2 areas around the skills that we use. What are our skills that we feel are strengths? 2 around tactics. 2 around mindset. And 2 around our support systems. So I see, as I mentioned on my postcard, I see if I've got good support at a race, I tend to do better. So I can see that as a real strength for me. I could see something around, as an athlete, my knowledge of sports psychology is a real strength. I know what to use when. So that would go down on my strengths audit. So really thinking through for you as coaches, what should be on your strengths audit that you can flag to yourself so that you remember to bring them in at those moments. When your amygdala kicks off, full of its emotion, what can you keep in front of mind with that rational zone that really helps you remember your strengths? The final area, self-awareness. I think the more we can understand ourselves, the more we understand the things we like, dislike, our fears, what triggers our amygdala, our strengths, as we've just looked at, our weaknesses, our preferences, our communication style. All of those things, we can work to create an environment where we perform better as coaches, but we can also notice where we're going to be in an environment where those might be triggered and be much more prepared for it, so we don't tend to panic or behave in a way that isn't good for us when it happens. So I really love to see people building that self-awareness. Often it's one of those things we do as we get older naturally, but if we can speed some of that up, it really helps us perform at a higher level. So I created this for my new book, but if anybody wants a copy, you're very welcome to get in touch and I'll send it over. But the reason I created it is because we tend to get very lazy with the emotions that we use. So there's research that shows there's about 7 basic emotions, and I think there's about 165 more specific emotions. The 10 I've got here are the ones that I noticed athletes saying the most to me. So when I say, like, how are you feeling right now? I'm fine, I'm happy. Frustrated comes up a lot. Angry, disgusted, excited sometimes, nervous. But they're quite generic, quite lazy words. And we know when we have those lazy words, we tend not to have great coping mechanisms for them. So if I am feeling powerless, my go-to coping mechanism is probably to go for a run, because I can control that. Can't control anything else going on, but I can control that. Can't do that more than once a day or I'm just going to get injured. But if I can actually get to the bottom of what's going on, maybe I'm actually feeling envious because other people are doing better than me. Well, I can have a much better, more sophisticated coping mechanism for envious. I can break down why I'm feeling envious and I can make a plan in place to fix that in myself so that I do better. So this is brilliant to use with athletes. I have laminated versions for mine that go on fridges. And particularly if you've got juniors, when somebody says, oh, I'm fine, it's like, no, how are you really feeling? So you start to build up your own emotional literacy and you start to build up much, much more specific coping mechanisms for those things that come up. So you can be more effective with the way you know yourself, the way you support yourself. So this can be a really helpful tool. And again, I use this with my 5-year-old. Can't read all the words yet, but we'll read them out. And she loves to know of, like, how are you feeling today? If she doesn't feel she has the language, we can talk her through it. And you can pull out, actually, I'm feeling a bit frightened. Brilliant. That's different from nervous. What are you scared of? What can we do about it? How can we help? So this can be really helpful to increase your emotional literacy. And then I also spend a huge amount of time working on values. And that comes from the approach that I take in psychology, which is called ACT, and is very focused. It's on acceptance and commitment therapy. It very much focuses on trying to live more in line with our values. But as you remember from one of those first slides on anxiety, when a value is violated, it tends to trigger our amygdala. If you can be much more aware of your values, you can figure out what to do in advance so that you don't react emotionally in the moment. But you can also create an environment where they're less likely to go off. Values are also brilliant because you can make decisions that are in line with them so you feel more authentic. And I use that a lot with athletes. We'll look at, I don't know whether to do this or this. And we'll look at their values very clearly. Which of those decisions would help you move more in line with this? And they're also very helpful if you're just having a bad day and you're not feeling very much like you, to pick out one of your values and go, for the next half an hour, I'm going to do something that's value-led. So one of mine was family. It might be, yeah, I'm going to get down on the floor and play Lego and make a house again with my 5-year-old because family matters, and that's the way of being more with her in that moment. So I have these. Again, if anyone wants to email me for these, you're very welcome. And I show these to athletes, and their job is to cross off as many as they can. And then we get really harsh and harsh until we've got 3. And their job is to find those 3 that really feel at the core, the heart of who they are. If you want to do it with athletes and make it a bit more fun, I'll often get them to go onto their phones, which they're always surprised about. They're allowed on their phones in a session, and scroll through the pictures, because we tend to take photos of the things that really matter to us. So if you can start looking at those photos and going, well, what theme is coming up here? What value must be important to you? How do we do more of that? But also, how do we look when that might get broken? That's really helpful. So if we pick a value on there, if you're a coach and discipline is important to you, that's one of your values. That really matters. That's how you've got where you've got. That's where your athletes do well. And you've got people that you coach in your team that have no discipline, and they're much more flexible and they don't seem to care. That could feel like a real trigger for your amygdala. It could feel incredibly personal, very difficult to work with those people. But having this insight and realizing that we have these values, in my years of doing this, everybody picks 3. No one has ever picked the 3 identical ones. And that's always a good reminder that we all have different values, and often the decisions we make based on them are not personal against anybody else. They're just personal to that person. And it can take a lot of that aggression or upset out of situations where you realize you've just got a different value to me. So they're helpful for you as coaches to know your own, but also to try and understand some of your athletes' values so you can see where there might be clashes and where you might need to communicate. So if anybody would like to chat on Twitter, that's where I spend way too much of my time. But I'm always going to talk a bit about sports psychology on there. There's lots of worksheets on my website, which is performanceinmind.co.uk. And I've got a section called Performance Zone, and that lists lots of different elements of this. Specifically for coaches or sports psychologists, training sports psychs, I have a book called Performing Under Pressure, and it lists the 9 reasons people tend to go and see sports psychs, and 64 of these techniques that you can use to work with people. I wanted to pull them all together. And then, as Adam mentioned, I've got a book on Audible that comes out in print in August called The 10 Pillars of Success. And within that, there are lots of worksheets. We've got 39 in the end. And it talks about 10 characteristics that we see in some of the most successful people in the world. And each chapter has almost like a case study of somebody amazing. So we've got Dame Kelly Holmes, Maxine Peake, Sarah Pascoe, different people in their worlds who are living that character. So all of those have lots more elements, but I would love to hear any questions.
Thank you very much for that, Josie. That was absolutely brilliant. And nice to see. I'm sure you've applied some of those techniques, because it's a very kind of smooth presentation that you put together, and you seem very relaxed and complete. So yeah, that's great. And yeah, any questions, anybody? Feel free to put your hand up, or put it in the chat, or just unmute yourself and ask away. I'll fill the void for a second, okay? Because I'm sure everybody's thinking, all right? So yeah, personally, I always find sessions like that really helpful in terms of, real practical solutions as well. And actually, as I kind of mentioned to Max and Tracy there, it's a really nice way of actually bringing the day to a close, really, because we've, had lots of different speakers, but to actually have some practical tips aimed for coaches from a sports side, I think is great. A question that I might have asked somebody else today, but it's always interesting to get other people's perspectives. But how easy or difficult have you found it to apply theory to practice? And just kind of a follow-up on that as well. What do you think perhaps academics could do to improve, to get the message across from research, so contemporary research, to those who are doing applied work and to actual coaches? So maybe that's two questions or something.
That's okay. So I do actually lecture at the Open University, but in my head I am very much not academic. I don't feel academic at all. And so I always feel quite vulnerable about that area, that I don't use theory enough. But I do find there are a few that work incredibly well on the implied sense. So what I use all the time is self-determination theory. If you can work with an athlete who's lost motivation, and you can talk about a theory like self-determination theory really clearly, with there are 3 pillars that help you have really good, strong intrinsic motivation, and they're mastery, competency, belonging, and autonomy. Let's dig into those. How can we increase the autonomy you have in your sport? How can we build up your mastery with maybe some skill sheets? How can we build up your belonging? Let's join some Facebook groups for your sport, because right now you're feeling really lonely. I find that is really helpful. And actually athletes tend to really like knowing that there's all of that research behind it and there's that theory there. So it's probably something I should do much more of. But I find that really helps. Particularly, I work a lot in private schools with very, very high achieving kids on scholarships, and they really want the evidence for why you are asking them to do something. And so when you are working with those type of groups of people, I find that really helpful. So I should do more of it. But if you can incorporate those theories in and explain that this has come from academic research, I think people will really clasp onto that and enjoy it. On your second element of what could academics do, oh, I'd love to see more. There are a few academics that are brilliant at getting out blog posts of research papers. I think one of the most frustrating things when I was doing my training, stage 2 training to be a sports psychologist, is you have no academic access. So you are trying to basically teach yourself these applied techniques and to work with athletes, and you're begging research papers off each other on WhatsApp groups because you've got no access to a library. So the more that researchers can find ways to get their papers and their findings out in simple ways, using social media probably, at conferences, making 1-page white papers would be amazing. Because as a practitioner, we get paid literally by the hour by our clients. So there isn't lots of time to do lots of extra research. But if someone can give you a 1-pager on, we've done this study, these were the athletes involved, these are the implications, this is how you could put it into practice, that would get used massively.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Josie. That's brilliant. So Rachel's got a follow-up question then. So how do you believe that we can support adolescents with self-determination theory and their sport and physical activity? And do you believe there are many factors to really consider?
Adolescence and autonomy, which is the key one in there, is so difficult because they're at that horrible stage where they desperately want to be independent and they can't. And they're trying to make their own decisions, and parents still have a huge amount of influence. There are little things I tend to do, like I will ask parents to, sounds awful, give their child a credit card so they can enter the competitions that they want for themselves, so that they can feel like they start to find ways to be more in control. There's some great research from Sam Thrower at Roehampton on the way parents engage with athletes, where they stick GoPro cams in the front of cars and they film the conversations that happen before and after events. And those are fascinating to talk with, particularly parents about, of your child doesn't need an extra coach, your child needs a supporter. And some of the time I'll then end up working with parents instead of their young athletes on, this is a brilliant way you can support your child in these ways, because the parents have much more time with them. And I'm often asked to work with under 10s, which I won't do, because I kind of figure if you're struggling that much with your sport under 10, you should find another sport. There's loads of brilliant ones out there. This isn't the one for you. But I sometimes will work with parents on how can you help your child get the most out of their sport, and that will pick up on those elements of self-determination theory.
Brilliant, thank you, Josie. So a question from Irina here. So thank you for an inspiring and informative talk. How do you manage clients' value systems when they do not match your own, or when they differ or in conflict with the organizational aims? This is something I was thinking as well, Irina, so a really good question, I think.
It's really hard. But I often work with entrepreneurs or people setting up new businesses, and we'll look at their values, and then I'll often say something like, right, I need to go and recruit loads of people with my values. And actually, that's why I feel a real conflict. It's like, no, you need loads of different values. Actually, I think we can really welcome different values and we'll all get something from it. Someone who worked for me years ago when I worked in the city in communications before I trained as a sports psychologist, at the time, I thought she was so difficult to work with, because every meeting we ever had, her role was to talk, or she felt her role was to talk about whether our policies, the government role, would work for accessibility and those with disabilities. And at the time, you'd roll your eyes, go, oh, here she goes again. She was one of the most influential people I've ever worked with, because she changed all our views on how to think about things, because her value system was so different from ours. And I've written to her recently to say, thank you for the way you behaved. You were amazing, and you changed government policy for the better, because your values were so strong and you pushed them upon us, even when we didn't always want to hear them. She made things better and we had much better outcomes. So I think when you accept your own, sometimes you won't always like your own, particularly if you're perfectionistic. Sometimes it can feel quite uncomfortable, but you also accept that other people have theirs and that there are no right or wrong values. They're just values. Then it's much easier to take a lot of that personal aggression out of it. You don't feel so threatened by somebody else's values. And then it doesn't matter what they are so much. You can see things from perspective.
Brilliant, thank you. Has anyone got any other questions for Josie? I've got another question. I've got loads of questions. Well, I haven't really, but I've certainly got one I'd like to ask. So I found this a really potentially a difficult situation, or one in terms of how I would like to know how you might address it. So, you said about this on the back of that postcard. So no session can ever be wasted. We've always got an action plan to that. So maybe we can always see, as psychologists or positive-minded coaches, that we can see the value of that. But how do you engage an athlete who finds that a little bit difficult to stomach. You know, they've just lost the biggest competition to them. They might have a different set of values, maybe, where they place it so much on being successful and achieving that goal of winning. How do you respond to those kind of athletes or individuals who might find that a little bit too positive, so to speak?
Fluffy. First of all, it's probably about timing of when you do that. So some athletes, actually, if they're very rational and kind of laid back, you can do that straight after their event and it's fine and they're able to see all sides of it. If you've got someone that's probably more prone to drama and very emotional about it, very tied in with it, that outcome feels like it's part of their identity, whether they win or lose. We definitely leave it a few days before we do that kind of activity. And you'll know they're that kind of athlete. The parents are always like, they're silent in the car home. If I ever try and ask about the competition, the event, I'll just get yelled at. It's like, yeah, then you don't do stuff straight away. You give them some time to reflect. And then, yeah, often still someone will be like, it was rubbish. It was a complete waste of time. I was embarrassing. That was awful. I want to quit the sport. And you get that drama. But it's still like, well, there will have been something you did well. And we'll drill through everything. Did you do any good volleys? Any good slices? Any good serves? Oh, well, yeah, that one was okay. So you might have to really dig, but you'll really find the stuff that they agree they did well. They'll have no problem telling you the stuff they did badly. But then from the things they did well, okay, how can you carry on doing more of that? You don't want to get rid of everything. And then from the things they want to change, they'll come up with some specifics, but that's great. And then from the change bits, that's easy to get the actions. I want to be able to shoot more on target. Great, what action can you take? Oh, I'm going to go to the park this week and I'm going to stay there until I get 25 goals on target. Fabulous. That will help you improve. That's your mastery developing. So they have to come up with everything. We can't do it for them. And if you're coaching someone through that, it really is helping them pull out, but it's got to all be in their own words.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Josie. Yeah. So we just got a question here from Emily. So she says that she loves it. And please, can you remind me of the second strategy for mastery mindset? So I got the postcard one, but what was the other one?
Oh, so that's the back of the postcard. And that's the analysis. So that's basically, did you achieve your goal? Moment of pride. What did you do well? What didn't you do so well? What would you keep? What would you change? What actions would you have?
Excellent. Cool. Just one more question for Josie, or we can leave it there if no one's got any other questions. Just give it a...
I just have a quick question, actually.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that, Josie. Thank you. It's just, obviously you work a lot with children. How do you maintain their engagement throughout sessions?
Oh, that one's tricky. I think one of my worst ever sessions was over Zoom with someone that spent the whole thing underneath the table on which the computer they were supposed to be speaking with was on, and had to keep calling the parents to come in and remove the child from under the table. I've had others where their anxiety is so strong, they've not said a word for 2 hours, and you have to just sit there in that moment and be with them. So I've definitely gone through the tough times on that one. What I tend to do now is try and meet children first. I will do some on Zoom because they're a long way away, but I'll always try and do a face-to-face, which really helps with that engagement. And I have loads of, I'm very one for things in sessions. So I'll try and get people to bring things with them sometimes, like a trophy they've won or something from their sport they're really proud of. I have these mood cards that I love. My daughter adores them. If she's having a bad morning and it's taken a while to get to school, I'll be literally like, do you want to get the cards out? And they're 50 cards. And you can they've got smiley faces if the kids are really young, but they've got moods written on them. They've got ideas on how to reflect those moods on the back. And so if I've got someone that just won't talk at all, it'll be like, right, I'll get the cards out on the floor, pick 3 or 4 of how you're feeling right now, and then pick 3 or 4 of how you would like to be feeling. And that's a really nice way of getting people from one place to another. There's little tips that actually a coach gave me a little tip. When you've got someone that's really struggling to engage, tell them something that is obviously wrong. I know, Man United compete in blue kit because they have to correct you. They cannot cope with it being left there. And then you get that spark. So physical stuff's really helpful. I do things like confidence jars all the times with kids. So they get 25 tiny pieces of paper and we have different things they have to write on them, and they go into a little jar, but they're all great things. So whenever they get anxious, they've got 25 messages to themselves to read. So the more physical stuff tends to really work better with kids if they get involved, and they're used to that from school anyway.
That's really great. Thank you.
Brilliant. Great question there, Lucy. Excellent. Okay, so thank you again to Josie. I think what I really like as well there is, we've talked about lots of different sports like principles, but I really like the creativity of thinking about, well, how can we get that message across to an individual, whether that be a young athlete, whether that be somebody at the top of their tree in business, how do we get that message across in a practical way so that people can understand that? So hopefully all of us have picked up a lot of different tips there then. So thank you very much again for that. And I'll just hand over to Tracy. So we'll kind of wrap the day up there. But yeah, on behalf of all of us, thanks again for that, Josie. That was brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josie. That was brilliant. So many creative tips. I loved it, and also just brought together a lot of the stuff that people were saying throughout the day. So that was a really lovely way to finish. And thank you for everyone's engagement throughout the day. I think a nice thing to do is to just have a little time to reflect on the day. And the aim of our day is really to try to provide coaches, practitioners with skills and ways to embed principles of psychology into their practice. So it would be great if you could put in the chat maybe something that you're going to stop doing based on what we've discussed, something that you might start doing, and something that you'll continue doing based on all the things that we've covered today. And Josie's kindly put her email in the chat. Something we can stop doing, something we're going to start doing, and something that we'll continue doing based on all the sessions that we've attended today. And while you're doing that, I'd just like to say thank you for everyone for attending. And I'd like to say thank you for all of our presenters today. I think you can agree with me that the presentations have been absolutely amazing throughout the day. Thank you to Max and Adam for helping with the organisation, and thank you to all the students who have been working hard behind the scenes despite having exams this morning. They've also presented, they've been working really hard with websites and social media, so it's been an absolute pleasure to work along with those students and also to hear them present on their work and their own passions. So I would like to extend the thanks to the group that have helped out, and also to the presenters and the people who have participated today. It wouldn't be the day it is without you guys attending. So on that note, Max, do you want to say something?
I just wanted to say thank you to you as well, Tracy. It would be amiss or remiss, one of the two, to start dishing out thanks without saying thank you to you, because your blood, sweat and tears, I'm sure all three of them in various amounts have been poured into have been genuinely poured into making this the success that it is, and it wouldn't be anywhere near as successful if it wasn't for you. So thank you very much, Tracy.
Thank you very much, Max. Very kind. Thank you, everyone. So nice. And on that note, in our evaluation, we've been funded by the Catherine Cookson Foundation, which allows us to the free event, but it also would be great to have your opinion, both to improve for next year, if we can keep it going, and also to show our funders that this is an important event where hopefully we've all taken something away from it. So on the screen is a QR code, hopefully you can see it, and you should be able to scan that with your phone, and then there's a link. And I also sent the link out when I sent the Zoom link as well, so you should have that there. So it would be great if you could fill out that evaluation, that's all we ask really, for your participation today. And hopefully the presentations that we managed to record, so I'm not going to be perfectionistic, and there were some technical issues throughout the day. Some of the morning sessions were not recorded, but the afternoon ones we sorted it out, so they will be put up on YouTube, and we will send out that link. So basically, if you fill out the evaluation, you'll get the link and you'll get a certificate as well. So look out for that. Hopefully they'll be up pretty soon. And yeah, thank you very much. If anyone's got any questions or feedback that they want to provide now, then that's great. But I think we've done pretty well with time. I'm only 6 minutes over. I think is pretty good going. And thanks for all these lovely messages coming in.
Great work, Tracy. Thanks to everyone as well. Brilliant contributions from everyone. There's so much expertise and experience across the day. It's been bloody brilliant.